the death of Jesus. In this episode, I'll be reading the four gospel accounts of Jesus' crucifixion and seeing how they compare, in the same way that I did with the Last Supper video. I'll be reading them in the order they were written to see how the accounts progress with each new version. Mark's account, being the earliest, is in chapter 15, verses 21 to 41. Certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. Then they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. They crucified him. Dividing up his clothes, they cast lots to see what each would get. It was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. The written notice of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." They crucified 2 rebels with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "So, you who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, come down from the cross. Save yourself." In the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law mocked him among themselves. "He saved others," they said, "but he can't save himself." Wow. Imagine if a pastor did something like that. Anyway, "Let this Messiah, this King of Israel, come down from the cross, that we may see him and believe." Those crucified with him also heaped insults on him. At noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. And at 3 p.m, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of those standing near heard this, they said, "Listen, he is calling Elijah." Someone ran, filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. "Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes down to take him," he said. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And then the centurion, who stood there in front of Jesus, saw how he died. He said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." Some women were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the younger and of Joseph, and Salome. In Galilee, these women had followed him and cared for his needs. Many other women who came up from Jerusalem were also there. Mark, as I said, is the earliest account, and we would expect it to be the simplest with the least detail. This account contains the key elements we are all familiar with. Simon of Cyrene. Who the hell is this guy anyway? And why is he not mentioned anywhere else? It feels like this is a kind of inserted character to get the cross away from Jesus, to help create the narrative of Jesus being special. Even with early accounts, we have suspicious detail. Has anyone ever pinpointed where Golgotha is? Why not? There is a familiar bit about Jesus' clothes being divided up, the note about Jesus being King of the Jews. These are odd details that have the feel of being inserted to make Jesus special. The 2 people crucified with Jesus are simply called rebels. Notice how they both mocked him. All versions have the sun darkening. Some suggest this is an eclipse, but that's not possible because of the length of time indicated and the point in the moon cycle where the Passover happens. The curtain being torn is also in all accounts. Reading Mark's account is easy to see how early versions of stories will contain fictionalized detail. Matthew's account is chapter 27, verses 32 to 55. As they were going out, they met a man from Cyrene called Simon, and they forced him to carry the cross. They came to a place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull, where they offered Jesus wine to drink mixed with gall. Doesn't sound very nice. After tasting it, he refused to drink it. When they crucified him, they divided up his clothes by casting lots, and sitting down they kept watch over him. Above his head they placed the written charge against him. "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." 2 rebels were crucified with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "You who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. Come down from the cross if you are the Son of God." In the same way, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders mocked him. Wow. "He saved others," they said, "but he can't save himself. He's the King of Israel. Let him come down from the cross, and we will believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now if he wants him. For he said, 'I am the Son of God.'" In the same way, the rebels who were crucified with him also heaped insults on him. From noon until 3 p.m, darkness came over all the land. About 3 p.m, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of those standing there heard this, they said, "He is calling Elijah." Immediately one of them ran and got a sponge. He filled it with wine vinegar, put it on a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. The rest said, "No, leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to save him." And when Jesus cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks split, and the tombs broke open. The bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. When the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and all that had happened, they were terrified. I probably would be too, to be honest, and exclaimed, "Surely he was the Son of God." Many women were there watching from a distance. They had followed Jesus from Galilee to care for his needs. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of Zebedee's sons. Matthew is very similar to Mark, much of it considered to be a straight copy, but even here we see new details being inserted. The note about being the King of the Jews gains a few words and is now being placed above Jesus' head. The mocking of Jesus as he's dying gains more words, and those who are being crucified with him are still rebels, and they also both still mock him. The tearing of the temple's curtain isn't enough, so an earthquake is added. But that's still not enough, so rocks are split and dead people come back to life. I wonder why the earthquake didn't topple the crosses. If it was strong enough to split rocks and break open tombs. This time it's not the centurion who declares him the Son of God, but multiple people who were there watching. Luke's account is chapter 23, verses 26 to 49. As the soldiers led him away, they seized Simon of Cyrene, who was on his way in from the country, and put the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. A large number of people followed him, including women who mourned and wailed for him. Jesus turned and said to them, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children. For the time will come when you will say, 'Blessed are the childless women, the wombs that never bore and the breasts that never nursed.' Then they will say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and the hills, 'Cover us.' For if people do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it is dry?" Yeah, weird. 2 other men, both criminals, were also led out with him to be executed. When they came to a place called the Skull, they crucified him there, along with the criminals, one on his right and the other on his left. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." I'm sure they do. And they divided up his clothes by casting lots. The people stood watching, and the rulers even sneered at him. They said, "He saved others, let him save himself, if he is God's Messiah, the chosen one." The soldiers who came up also mocked him. They offered him wine vinegar and said, "If you are the King of the Jews, save yourself." There was a notice written above him which reads, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. "Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other criminal rebuked him. "Don't you fear God," he said. "Since you are under the same sentence, we are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom? Jesus answered him, truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m, for the sun stopped shining, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Jesus called out in a loud voice, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. When he had said this, he breathed his last. No Elijah? The centurion, seeing what had happened, praised God and said, surely this was a righteous man. When all the people who had gathered to witness this sight saw what took place, they beat their breasts and went away. But all those who knew him, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance watching these things. Jesus gains a few lines of dialogue during his journey to the crucifixion site, as well as while he is on the cross. This is where we introduce to the phrase, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. You'd think that such a memorable phrase would have been included in all accounts, but apparently not. The mocking of Jesus has changed slightly with some new specific details. The notice is still above Jesus' head, but the text has changed again. We also have the significant change of only one of those being crucified with Jesus mocking him. The other one apparently recognises Jesus for who he is. Again, you'd think that all accounts would have a detail as critical as this. This is exactly the sort of difference that indicates a narrative that is evolving over time. The post-death phrase recognising Jesus as being righteous has changed from him being the Son of God, and it's back to just a centurion saying it. The earthquake has disappeared, but Jesus' death is a little more dramatic. It's this kind of subtle differences that leads scholars to suggest that those who wrote Luke and Matthew copied from Mark, each using Mark as a base and adding their own independent embellishments. John's account is in chapter 19, verses 16 to 36. So the soldiers took charge of Jesus, carrying his own cross, who went out to the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. Where's Simon? There they crucified him with two others, one on each side and Jesus in the middle. Pilate had a notice prepared and fastened to the cross. It read, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Many of the Jews read this sign, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city. And the sign was written in Aramaic, Latin and Greek. No English. The chief priests of the Jews protested to Pilate, do not write the King of the Jews. But this man claims to be the King of the Jews. Pilate answered, what I have written, I have written. When the soldiers crucified Jesus, they took his clothes, dividing it into 4 shares, one for each of them, with the undergarment remaining. This garment was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. Let's not tear it, they said to one another. Let's divide it by lot who will get it. Let's decide by lot who will get it. This happened that the scripture might be fulfilled that said, they divided my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment. Convenient. So this is what the soldiers did. Near the cross of Jesus stood his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother there and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to her, woman, here is your son, and to the disciple, here is your mother. From that time on, this disciple took her into his home. I did read this beforehand, I promise. Later, knowing that everything had now been finished so that scripture would be fulfilled, Jesus said, I am thirsty. A jar of wine vinegar was there. Convenient. So they soaked a sponge in it, put the sponge on a stalk of a hyssop plant, and lifted it to Jesus' lips. When he had received the drink, Jesus said, it is finished. With that he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. Now it was a day of preparation, and the next day was to be a special Sabbath, because the Jewish leaders did not want the bodies left on the crosses during the Sabbath. They asked Pilate to have the legs broken and the bodies taken down. Thoughtful. The soldiers therefore came out and broke the legs of the first man who had been crucified with Jesus, and then those of the other. And when they came to Jesus, they found he was already dead. They did not break his legs. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. The man who saw it has given testimony, and his testimony is true. He knows he is telling the truth, and he testifies that you may also believe. Yeah, that's convincing. These things happened so that the scripture would be fulfilled. Not one of his bones will be broken. And the scripture says, they took on the one they have pierced. Simon of Cyrene has been dropped completely, as though he's taking too much attention from Jesus, and instead Jesus carries his own cross. The note is still there. The text has changed again, and this time it's in multiple languages to really drive the point home. The writers obviously could not agree on what it was they had supposedly been written about Jesus. Such sloppiness. Pilate now gets a chance to justify what he wrote. Who could possibly have had contact with the chief priests to find this one out? And yet another detail that feels like it's inserted fiction. The separating of Jesus' clothes gains new detail too. I wonder what eventually happened to that untorn garment. That would have been very valuable. Oh, silly me, it was made up, wasn't it? We have the extra detail of the testing of the death of Jesus with a spear in his side. Again, this is a crucial detail that seems to be forgotten by the earlier accounts. Or is this too another added fact? The sponge that is used to feed Jesus comes after he says he is thirsty. Another added detail. As with the washing of Jesus' disciples' feet, we see that when you read the different accounts of Jesus' crucifixion and death, there is clear progression in the narrative. And this is exactly the kind of changes that happen when stories evolve over years and decades of retelling with added fabrication. And this is why I and others simply do not accept the Gospels or the Bible as anything other than a human book telling human stories.